All right, we're going to take you back to Capitol Hill now, where some of the world's biggest tech company CEOs are set to testify before lawmakers today. It's a subcommittee that's focused on antitrust, whether or not the CEOs of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google are perhaps stifling competition. We're talking about combined companies that are close to sort of $1 trillion worth of assets there. So CBS News political contributor Molly Hooper and CNET senior producer Dan Patterson are here to talk us through this whole thing. Molly, I want to start with you. It's not the first time that, these CEOs, and in particular I'm thinking of Mark Zuckerberg, that have been grilled in front of Congress. In the other cases, though, it had to do with the content, whether there was bias, what they were doing in regards to influence in the 2016 election. This is different, though. This is antitrust stuff. So what's going to be the focus?
Well, actually, Anne-Marie, this is a much-watched, much-anticipated hearing because Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, has not appeared before Congress, and Congress has wanted to hear from Jeff Bezos firsthand for years. And essentially, this hearing has been about a year in the making. Unlike a lot of other hearings we see up on Capitol Hill, to the chagrin of many, are not as informed. And on this topic in particular, the antitrust subcommittee headed by David Cicilline of Rhode Island has spent over a year looking into the online platforms and whether they are too big and stifling their competition, as you said. And they've looked at how it's affected the news business, how it's affected potential competitors. And so this is the culmination of almost a year's worth of work. And during that time, the panel, the subcommittee, has acquired nearly 1.3 million documents. They've had something like 93 hours of testimony with people involved in these committees and whatnot. And really, there's about 15 members who are going to be grilling these CEOs as to whether their companies are unfairly edging out competitions in their respective lanes. For example, Amazon. Is Amazon using the private data that it gets from the third-party sellers to essentially bolster its own sales of its own products? Is it doing that? Because Jeff Bezos said that he wasn't. However, it sounds like, from what I've heard from lawmakers, the lawmakers have evidence that Amazon has in fact been doing that. And if that is the case, then that's very troubling for this emerging marketplace, this emerging over the past 20 years almost, that has trillions of dollars at stake. And consumers can't choose which company to go with or which product to use if there's no competition. So I think that's one of the things that we'll really see drilled down on in this subcommittee.
Vlad, before you jump in, I just want to make a correction in my throw. The companies together are actually worth $5 trillion. Not $1 trillion, $5 trillion. All right.
I'm sure there were a lot of those CEOs who ran to look at their bank accounts, Anne-Marie, when you said that. When you have that moment when you're like, hey, I wonder if that check's going to clear. Now I only have a couple of trillion instead of $5 trillion. Dan, let me ask you about the pandemic and how much Americans have come to rely on the services of these companies, perhaps more than they did previously. And it makes me sort of wonder if this pandemic had hit before the rise of these companies, what we would be doing. My guess is probably baby boom version 2 and a lot of books being written, a lot of art being produced, but instead we're sitting on our couches watching a lot of Netflix and Googling. So could that influence how Congress views these CEOs?
Speak for yourself, Vlad. I'm creating art every single day. Hey, look, I know for a lot of us, it sure feels as though we're defending on these tech platforms a lot more. And I know anecdotal data isn't a replacement for real numbers, but when I look at my screen time report on my iPhone, the data it gives you every week about your usage, it's up, and it's always up, at least since the pandemic has started. And I have similar usage across social networks, but let's actually look at the data. So this is back in April. Let's rewind like what feels like 10 years was only 4 months. Back in April, Facebook saw a surge almost immediately. They went from the key performance performance indicator. The number social platforms care about is called a DAU. That's a daily active users. And Facebook's, just on Facebook, surged from 1.66 billion to 1.73 billion. That's according to Facebook's own stats. Now, of course, we know that Facebook isn't just Facebook. It's a family of apps. It's a spectrum of apps. It is Facebook, but it's also Facebook Messenger. It's Instagram. It's WhatsApp. And all of those platforms combined surged to 2.36 billion daily active users. So, again, this doesn't speak for the broad spectrum of tech platforms, but looking at just Facebook, yeah, that's a lot of usage surging almost instantly.
Right.
So, Molly, the CEOs are going to be testifying together. Some of them, they'll be remote and everything, but they're together as opposed to, individually. And we all remember when we saw Mark Zuckerberg make that lonely walk. Well, he wasn't very lonely walk down the hall. He was surrounded by people, but sitting at that desk all by himself. Do you think that will sort of change the hearing, the fact that they will all be there together?
Well, I think there's two things that are going to change the hearing. Number one, they aren't going to be all together because they are all going to be remote. And I have clocked many hours of watching these new remote hearings, and I got to tell you, the number of times there have been unmuted microphones. Sharon, are you there, Sharon? Sharon, you got to unmute your microphone. That eats into the time that the members have to ask questions. And if they're doing that for each CEO, that really impacts how organic this hearing will be. But also, members of the committee did actually want to have these CEOs up individually because each one of these companies represent different lanes. It's social networking, Facebook owning 80-some, apps for social networking. That edges out a lot of competition for other potential social networking sites, right? So that's its own lane. Google, like I said, with the third-party market sellers and basically using that data to, hurt its competitors. And then you have Google with information and searching, Apple with the App Store, all these apps that people are now depending on because of the pandemic. Can competitors adequately compete in the app marketplace? So those are four totally different aspects of this global online platform world. And many lawmakers on that panel did want to have these hearings separately. But, as it is, they have to come up with legislation if they want to address this, because ideally what's going to happen and coming out of this, year-long investigation is Congress will come up with some kind of legislation to regulate this largely unregulated industry, and they need to do that sooner rather than later, given the election is in less than 100 days.
You definitely had a moment, Molly, where our senior producer, Sharon, had a fit in her home studio because she thought you were mentioning her when you said that she was unmuted, or she really did, and especially because one of her kids may have unmuted her microphone at one point, so you definitely freaked her out. Dan, let me ask you, I had this conversation earlier, Anne Marie and I did, with Roger Chang, your colleague over at CNET. And, I'm still sort of curious about what folks like, for example, Mark Zuckerberg are really looking for. On one hand, Zuckerberg has written op-eds where he's talked about more meaningful regulation of the internet, but that would seem to be self-defeating. And so on one hand, it makes me skeptical because I just sort of think, well, that's a PR effort to write an op-ed and say, yes, please regulate the internet and please regulate me, when in fact you know that more regulation would mean less money for you, less money for your business, less revenue, less money for your shareholders if you're one of these tech CEOs. So are they really looking for any kind of regulation? And if they are, what kind of regulation would they welcome? And what kind of regulation, more importantly, would they not welcome?
You bring up a great point, Vlad. Look, these companies, like Molly said, they're ostensibly here because regulation is on the table. You don't get Tim Cook or Jeff Bezos or Sundar Pichai. You don't get executives like Mark Zuckerberg to show up at one place at one time unless they are really terrified of something. What is that? Well, it's regulation. This has been used as a cudgel to beat them with. It's been used as a threat. It's been used in all number of different facets. But Vlad, your question is the correct question to ask, which is, can regulation be applied in any meaningful way? And there is the on-the-record response, which they give. Your read is the same as mine, which is it's good PR to say, hey, look, please regulate me. This goes back to the open source days of the internet where open and free trade of information and ideas, blah, 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 blah. The reality is when I talk to people off the record at Facebook, when we sit down and have coffee in San Francisco, or when I talk to people at Twitter, I know they're not testifying today, but they say very similar things, at Google, elsewhere, they say that, look, we really wish that we had a system that was a little more similar to China's managed capitalism so we could pursue our interests without the fear of regulation. The number one thing we fear is regulation. That's what they tell me. And not just me, they tell almost every tech reporter who pries into them off the record, they're terrified of regulation.
Can I just jump into that? Because I think that what we are going to hear from CEOs...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. What I think we are going to hear from these CEOs is that what they are providing for the public, they're doing it largely for free. And they are not making a lot of money off of individual consumers. And not only that, they have to compete with these Chinese companies who don't have a lot of regulation, as Dan said. And it's going to be interesting to see how the lawmakers on that panel, which largely have been, unlike most panels, have been bipartisan when it comes to, moving forward with some kind of regulation on this tech industry, how they react to those type of defenses and what lines of questionings is pursued. And again, this is a smaller subpanel, so it will only be about 15 to 17 members asking questions, but they should be detailed. And I anticipate what I've heard from some lawmakers is that these CEOs are going to push back with, well, we have to compete with China and TikTok, and we also are providing our product to consumers for free. Meanwhile, they are getting a lot from those consumers, a lot of data from those consumers, but at the same time, that would be their pushback.
Yeah, I mean...
All right, cool, guys.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how this all unfolds. Like we pointed out before, we have 4 different CEOs providing very different services to us, but they are all meeting in this one place. They are dominant forces in their marketplace and in our lives, and you got to be a little concerned about that. So we are waiting for this hearing to get underway. When it starts, we're going to dip into it. Want to thank Molly and Dan for joining us. For now, though, we're going to get you caught up on some of the other days' news and take a quick break. You're streaming CBSN.